Our purpose for today, we have two. The first is that we're going to spotlight the foundations of literacy as a strand and just take a look at some of the new aspects of that strand of our standards. And I want us to also look at how we can develop a plan for applying today's learning. Our two success criteria that we're going to focus on include identifying areas of the foundations of literacy strand that will be our focus. So looking and seeing what are the areas that we really need to focus our attention as we're implementing this new strand in our standards. But then we're also going to explore a process called the cross-check method that helps us to break down indicators for effective instruction. So a jam-packed hour, like I said. Now, if you're joining us today and you're thinking, well, I just signed up because I signed up for all of the ELA webinars, then you may have just a bit of pause if you're a middle or high school teacher, because our work really will focus today around those K through 2 indicators in the foundations of literacy. So if that's something that maybe doesn't quite align to your lens or the audience that you support, I want you to rest assured that we have 3 more webinars coming up that explain the cross-check method, that process for breaking down indicators for effective instruction. The first is the cross-check method on applications of reading, which will be on February 26th, where we'll be using elementary level examples. Then we have the cross-check method for research on March 11th, where we'll be using a middle level example. Then finally, on March 18th, we have the cross-check method for the communications strand, where we'll be exploring a high school level example. Now, we know that the cross-check method is not level specific and it's not strand specific. So you're welcome to join any of these sessions to explore the cross-check method with us and really dive deeper into each of those strands specifically. But we just wanted you to know that if you don't feel particularly represented at the middle or high school level this morning in this webinar, you do have some forthcoming webinars that will really support that lane as well. So with that said, let's get into some housekeeping. The first thing I'd like is for my team to introduce ourselves. My name is Mandy Hawker, and I am the Elementary ELA Ed Associate here at the South Carolina Department of Education, and I deal primarily with the standards. The rest of my team also lives that standards life. I have Tabitha Hughes Sutton with me. She's our middle level education associate.
Then good afternoon, everybody. I'm so glad to be with y'all. And as Mandy said, I represent the middle school standards on the standards side.
Then we have Brenda McCormick with us.
Hey everyone, I am secondary ELA education associate.
And then we have Casey Prince Harvey.
Good afternoon, everyone. Casey Prince Harvey, Education Associate for Humanities and ELA Support, also on the standards side of the Office of Assessment and Standards. Happy to be here.
And I wanted to take that moment just to make sure we introduce our team, because at one point in our session today, you'll be given a little bit of homework, and you may have some homework to reach out to one of us individually. So just knowing that, I wanted you to put a name with a face if you weren't familiar with our team, but we're happy to be with you today. In the chat now, Brenna is going to drop the note catcher that we're going to use today. The note catcher is a place for you to capture your thinking, but also it will be where all of the links for today live. So we have several links that we'll be accessing and looking through. Those will live in our note catcher. Additionally, we ask that you provide us some attendance information each of our webinars and each of the sessions we provide, just so that's fine, Julie, no problem. You provide us that attendance information just so we know the audience that we're supporting here and how we can better meet the needs of that audience. So if you will, access that link in the chat for the note catcher, but also that attendance link. After you've pulled up both of those, I want you also to drop into the chat who you are. Tell us your name, your location, and then what is your role this morning, just so we can kind of get a gauge on tailoring our presentation to the roles that you serve. All right, I see a lot of coaches. That's great. Coaches, you will definitely be able to use this cross-check method with the audience that all the audiences that you support. The cross-check method is a great tool for those PLCs or grade level work. Awesome. Awesome. And hey, I think we were down in some of y'all's neck of the woods this past week at Kiowa. So that's great. Extra focused on those foundations. Yes, you are, Allison. Awesome. Awesome. I'm so excited to see so many people just that we can support this morning with this overview of foundations, but also with that cross-check method. So that being said, let's look at our agenda for today. For our agenda, we are going to take a look at the overview of the Foundations of Literacy strand. We're going to take a deep dive into the cross-check method for understanding and implementing indicators, and then a little bit of clarity and closure. So, thinking about our Foundations of Literacy, this is a strand. I'm going to try to mute my chat really quick. I'm sorry. Let's see if I can figure out how to do that. Okay. The Foundations of Literacy focuses on 4 areas. Those areas include phonological and phonemic awareness, concepts of print, decoding and encoding phonics skills, and then finally, fluency. We know that the National Reading Panel outlined in 2000 5 pillars that comprised reading instruction, and those were phonological awareness, phonics, and fluency, all 3 of which live in the Foundations of Literacy. And then we also have vocabulary and comprehension. Those will be covered on February 26th when we look at the applications of reading as a strand. But this morning, I want us to focus our attention and work on the Foundations of Literacy. There are 4 standards within the Foundations of Literacy: the phonological and phonemic awareness, print concepts, decoding and encoding phonics skills, and fluency. Now, there are 23 indicators within this strand. That's a lot of expectations, and a lot of that rests heavily on the shoulders of kindergarten, 1st, and 2nd grade. There are 2 indicators within the Foundations of Literacy that extend into 3rd grade and 5th grade, and those fall in the standard of fluency. So if you support kindergarten through 2nd grade or kindergarten through 5th grade teachers, this is a heavy lift for you and your team. When we think about some of the shifts that the Foundations of Literacy expects for students, our findings are that we currently match the national expectations for Foundations of Literacy. In the past, South Carolina in the 2015 standards had a deficit area where we did not have explicit expectations for phonemic awareness and phonological awareness. And additionally, we didn't have a systematic explicit expectation in regard to phonics. So by developing the Foundations of Literacy strand with those 4 standards and 23 indicators, we include we include extensive work on phonemic awareness skills. That's standard 1. We have a very concentrated focus on systematic explicit phonics. And I want to explain that. Systematic means that there is a reason to the order of how the phonics skills are taught. And explicit means that it comes from my mouth to your ears in the classroom. So the teacher says it and the students hear it explicitly. Now, that can be a big shift where in the past, maybe we've had students to recognize phonic patterns, or we've only done phonics work with intervention or targeted leveled groups. No, now we expect Tier 1 instruction for all students to include that phonics instruction. Let's let that sink in for a second. It's a big expectation, right? All right. Additionally, we have fluency expectations that extend to 5th grade because we know that fluency indicates comprehension. And we have decoding strategies that extend into 3rd grade. And that's going to be an indicator that we look at closely today. All right. But the best way of knowing what's included in the Foundations of Literacy strand is for you to get your hands on those standards and indicators, right? So our standards are the overall expectation, but the indicators are what the expectations are at each grade level. What we want you to do today is to wrap this strand. And wrap means to first read and review the Foundations of Literacy strand. So we'll drop that link in the chat. I think Brenna just did. And we just want you to read it, review it. What do you notice? And then we want you to annotate using the highlight tool or circle feature, however you'd like. Annotate any important indicators. What indicators stand out most to you? What contains language that maybe you're not familiar with, or the audiences that you support aren't familiar with? Annotate those important indicators. And then finally, we want you to pick 3 that are the most impactful for the audience that you serve. So maybe your school, you see that you really struggle with this or that. Maybe your classroom that you support struggles in one particular area. But pick 3 that you feel would have the most impact for the audience that you serve. We're going to give you about 8 minutes to do this activity. So I'm trying to add 12:21, we'll come back together, and I want you to be able to share in the chat the indicators that you found that were most impactful, those pick 3. You have about 4 minutes left to wrap this strand. If you want to go ahead and start dropping into the chat some of the important indicators that you noticed, or any of the 3 that you picked that would have the greatest impact on the audience you support, our team would love to support your answers in the chat. Additionally, you all may have entered with a lot of background knowledge about the foundations of literacy and may have already been doing your independent study of this strand. So you may be familiar with the indicators that you anticipate are going to have the most impact on your school district or classroom. We'd love to see those in the chat. Oh, yes, Angie. 3, 6, 7, and 8. Woo. 3, 8, 3, 7. Yes. Oh, I see that over and over. Oh, Christy Adams, I love that you mentioned the Fluency Standard 2. With the encoding, Angie. Oh, I love that you mentioned that. Oh, Miss Jones, I love 1.5. One thing that I'm noticing as you put your standards codes into the chat, first of all, I'd like to compliment you all on using the codes correctly. That is such a growth place for us in our state. I know, especially for us generalists, right? We're using 4 different types of codes right now. And that can be a little bit overwhelming. So when I see you putting these ELA codes in correctly, it makes me so proud. The new content revisions that are coming out with math, they follow our code. So how encouraging is that for us as elementary generalists? Oh, I love what you said, Christy Gwen. Yes, they would need to be taught a lot of these standards before being able to be successful with F 4.1. Many of these indicators are contingent upon one another for success. It makes me think about when we think about the standards in general, if you miss any level, it can be detrimental to the foundation, right? Well, the foundation has to be built well as well. So all of these standards have to be built specifically and intentionally so that we have a very strong support for our base knowledge in order to get to that comprehension and vocabulary. Oh, and I love that as I look through these and scroll through, we see so many different indicators. That is a underline, an asterisk, and a highlight that this Foundations of Literacy strand is going to have new content for every single audience. And every single school is going to be different. So I think that's one aspect of why I love the cross-check method and what we're going to look at next. So, all right. Looking at my findings, here's what I thought were the most impactful standards in Foundations of Literacy. First of all, the whole standard of F1, that phonemic and phonological awareness. To me, that's a lot of brand new information, not something that I felt incredibly confident in when the standards were first being developed. Additionally, F 3.8 contains a lot of expectations. Unpacking all of the different phonics expectations within F 3.8 is going to require long-range plans. I mean, that's your scope and sequence for the year of those phonics expectations. And that's pretty difficult. And finding materials that meet those expectations is pretty tough. But the indicator that I want us to focus on today is that F 4.3. This falls under the fluency standard, and it deals with reading and decoding strategy expectations. This is quite a shift from the expectations in the 2015 standards, with intentional word choice around looking at the segmenting and blending and word analysis piece that leads to successful decoding. So that's where we're going to focus our attention today. But before we get to that, I want us just to do a little stop and jot. Oftentimes, we get busy in the work of the standards and indicators and how do we implement this and how do we do it as fast as possible, right? We have a deadline. By the 2024-25 school year, we got to have a plan and be off and running. But I want us to take a moment to pause and think about what impact will the foundations of literacy have on student performance in our state? Then think about what would we see in 20 years from now if the foundations of literacy as a strand served their purpose? What would we see? You can respond to this in box 3 of your note catcher, but I'd also love to see your answers in the chat. We'll give you 1 minute to kind of think through that. Drop it in the chat for us. Oh, yes, Merica. And that right there is at the heart of the foundations of literacy. We're going to have less students graduating high school unable to read. And, oh, Angie Showalter, I love this. I wish I could catch all these comments as they come in, but we'll be more adept at anticipating which children may struggle to learn to read. Confident readers and writers. And students can comprehend better if they can access the text. And so the foundations of literacy is giving all students access to the text. Improve literacy skills. Now we know there is no magic bullet or one antidote solution to literacy issues in our state or in our nation. But we do feel that a concerted focus on the foundations of literacy as a strand will have a positive impact on our students because everyone will be given the same information and the same instruction so that students spend less time trying to figure word out and more time comprehending the text. Sharon, oh yes, I love that. Awesome. Thank you so much. So with that in mind, the work that we have in front of us is challenging, but I want us to commit to this work so that we can implement that change. Our students in South Carolina are worth it for us to commit to the hard work that this Foundations of Literacy strand puts in front of us. That being said, let's move on to part 2. And we're going to take a look at something called the cross-check method. Now, you may have explored the cross-check method with us before. But I want you to take a look at this little paragraph that we're about to show you that explains the cross-check method. As you read that paragraph, I want you to tell us which words draw your attention. You can drop those in the chat. Yes, intentional. I love that. And specific, aligned, and rigor. Special populations, I love that. Yes, thank you all. It's an indicator aligned instructional series. Okay, I'm so glad you're noticing the words that are impactful to me as well. So this cross-check method is a template that's going to provide guidance to us as classroom teachers or coaches or even administrators on how to deconstruct and instruct some of our most complex indicators. Now, before we move forward, I want to draw your attention to one thing. Listen to that I said our most complex indicators. Please hear me say that the cross-check method does not have to be completed with every indicator that you might teach as a classroom teacher. The cross-check method is intentionally chosen to support the instruction and deconstruction of our indicators for our most complex indicators. So let's take a look at that. The cross-check method contains 6 steps, CROSS check. So the first being our C, content and skills. The R, meaning rigor and questioning. The O, by writing objectives. The S, meaning our success criteria and assessment. Our second S is the sequence of mini lessons to reach the intention of the indicator. And then finally, the last step, that check, where we're checking for alignment to the indicator and we're reflecting after we've taught. Let's pause and ponder for just a second. What do you think from your lens is the most important step? And then, how does this align with how you already plan? Maybe you're a classroom teacher and you're already writing lesson plans. How does the cross-check method apply and align with what you already do? Or maybe you're facilitating PLC groups or the literacy plan in your school. How does this align with how you plan for that? Drop in the chat answers to either of those questions. I know for me, accessing some of these indicators, the most important step would be that content and skills. There are some terms I'm going to need to look up, right? And get my base knowledge confident. Oh, I love that this aligns with how you already. Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that, Dory. Yes, it does match a PLC planning cycle. And making sure it aligns with that success criterion assessment. Because we got to have evidence that we met the indicator, right? Very good. Okay. Alignment is key. The alignment is key. Yes, y'all are exactly right. Okay. Well, when we think about those 6 steps, it can sometimes be overwhelming to think, I got to do all 6 of these things with the indicators that are tough. Well, let's break it down for you in a little easier to understand and manage way. Our template, the cross-check method template, can be viewed as 3 separate pieces of just one plan for how to instruct indicators. The first is the destination. That includes your C, your content and skills, your R, your rigor and questioning, your O, your objectives, and your first S of success criteria and assessment. The destination is really understanding where are we going in this indicator. Now the map, that's the part where you are looking at your sequence of mini lessons. That's your plan of how you're going to instruct this in as few or as many mini lessons necessary to get to the rigor of that selected indicator. Now the check part is where we check for alignment before instruction begins. So we're making sure that our plan aligns to each aspect of the indicator before we ever start our instruction. And then our reflection is our after implementation. So after we've done our instructional plan, we can reflect and see, how did we do? What could be improved? What needs to be removed or added? Or what are our next steps for Tier 2 instruction? All right, with that in mind, I want us to take a look at a Foundations of Literacy example. In your note catcher in box 6, you have a copy of the cross-check method that we're going to walk through today. So first, let's take a look at the C, content and skills. The standard that we're focusing on for today's example is Fluency Standard 4. And that is read and reread grade appropriate text with accuracy and expression at an appropriate rate to support comprehension. Now that's their end of education expectation. That's the standard. The indicator, though, is what's expected at the specific grade level. Looking at this code, we know what grade is this. Can anybody tell me what grade level we're looking at? It's like a pop quiz on how to read indicator codes. First grade, Allison. Ding, ding, ding. You get the gold star today. Very good. Very good. Yes, this is a first grade indicator. All right. So in first grade, we want students to read text by using letter sound knowledge to segment and blend. We want them to be able to decode words by analogy, and we want them to read by using context and visuals to support self-monitoring and self-correcting. Quite some expectations, right? We'll do that in one class period, right? Not at all. Because this indicator is so heavy hitting and so jam-packed, it's important for us to break it down with that cross-check method. So let's look at the content. The content, one term in the content that I really needed support in understanding was that term visuals. Now, I think I know what visuals mean. That's the pictures, right? Or is visuals how the word looks? Well, since I don't know, I'm going to go to our glossary and find the definition so that I ensure that my instruction of the indicator matches the expectation intended. In the glossary for our 2023 ELA standards, visuals is defined as images, illustrations, pictures, photographs, or other graphic designs. In my instruction, I want to make sure that I have a representation of visuals very clearly when we're going through that expectation of the indicator or that aspect of the indicator. Now, as far as skills, some of the skills mentioned include segmenting sounds. I know what that is. Blending sounds. I know what that means. Decoding, though. Decoding is defined in our glossary. So the definition from the glossary says this act of sounding out a word using knowledge from graphemes. It's important for me to focus myself on that definition. There's lots of definitions of decoding, but in regard to our standards, this is how decoding is defined. This is an intentional first step to ground myself in that information. Now let's go to rigor and questioning. Step R. With rigor and questioning, the first thing I want to do is notice what is the DOK level of this indicator. Well, we have a support document here linked in the template. It says click for support for identifying DOK, and that's where you can go and access any support your audience may need for identifying DOK. So maybe you're working with some first-year teachers or teachers who are new to understanding DOK. This might be a good resource for them. But when I look at segment, blend, decode, and use visuals and context, all of that feels like a DOK level 1. So I understand that my DOK level for this indicator is pretty simple. Now we're going to let Brenna talk about the questioning aspect of this step.
Yes. So when teachers are evaluated in South Carolina, your administrators are going to use that South Carolina teaching rubric, the 4.0 rubric, and that data gets sent back to the State Department and the Office of Teacher Accountability, and then they share the data with us. And one thing we've noticed from that data is that there is an area for growth within questioning. And so we wanted to make sure that the cross-check method included some intentional pause when it comes to questioning and planning for questioning. So we do that through 2 types of questioning: collaborative discussion questioning and then text-dependent questioning. So your collaborative discussion questions are really intended to guide students to engage in conversation with each other about a text. So these questions are going to be opinion questions. They are going to be able to get these right, because if it's your opinion, it's right. Okay, so we want them to start having conversations about the text they're reading. Things like, what is your first reaction? What are the most important details? How is your understanding like others? Again, the key point is for students to talk about the text. Then we have what are called text-dependent questions. These are going to be much more complex because they directly align to indicators. Where your collaborative discussion questions are going to use maybe indicator adjacent language, text-dependent questions use indicator language. Those are grade level expectations. So by the end of this unit, students should be able to answer this question because that is what the indicator requires. So obviously these look a little different. How does the author's choice of words shape the tone of the text? How does the author's use of personification impact the meaning? You can see the complex difference or the difference in complexity between the two. So if I know our K2 students don't necessarily take SC Ready, but if you're sitting down to have a conference to see can the student decode, I'm not going to be able to say, okay, turn and talk to Johnny. Y'all decide how you're going to solve this word. If you're elementary school teacher, middle school teacher, you can't say turn and talk when it comes to the SC Ready. We're not turning and talking on the EOC. So how do we bridge the gap between the text-dependent question where students are having those valuable conversations, the collaborative discussion questions where they're having those valuable conversations, and then the text-dependent question that they have to answer independently. And we do it with a plan. We use collaborative discussion questions as a scaffold to indicator language. So I'm going to show you an example, and this example is a 7th grade example. We just wanted to pick a random one so that you can see what this process looks like. So the indicator that has been chosen is AOR 1.2. This is just an example, and that indicator says analyze how figurative language impacts mood, tone, and meaning. So when you're going through the cross-check method and you've chosen your indicator, the first thing you want to do when it comes to questioning is decide what is your text-dependent question. What's that overall goal? By the end of this instructional series, students should be able to answer this independently. For this particular example, I said, how does the author's use of figurative language impact the tone of the text? It's direct indicator language. But if I'm a brand new 7th grader and that's the first question you ask me, what words are going to give me pause and make me think, oh, what is she talking about? You can put them in the chat. Impact. Yeah, everybody says impact. Tone. Yes. Maybe even figurative language, right? Author's use. Exactly. Those are the same words that I said. Figurative language, impact, and tone. So my job when I'm planning and using this template is to then develop collaborative discussion questions that scaffold students into independently answering this question. So if I know figurative language is a problem, I need to get them talking about figurative language without using those scary ELA terms, right? I need to get them talking about impact and tone, just having conversations and feeling successful in those. Now, we can't live in those conversations. We've got to get them to the indicator language, but we also have to start somewhere. So example might be, how does this text make you feel and what words make you feel that way? I didn't use the words mood, tone, or author's word choice, but that's what they're talking about. Did your feelings change at any point? What made them change? Now I'm including impact without using the word impact. Where does the author make an exaggeration and how did it make you feel? Now we're including figurative language. Again, this is what I would refer to as indicator adjacent language. We just want students purposefully talking about the text, questions that align with indicators, so that eventually we can give them that language. They don't live in this world of how does it make you feel or what made it change forever. But that's where they can start so that we can then talk about tone and impact. Okay, Mandy, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Okay, so with that in mind, I wrote some CDQs that would align to the indicator that we're discussing. Okay. Remember that one of the terms in our indicator is segment. So how can we segment this word? Instead of asking that, which would be more text dependent, we could ask a collaborative discussion question of how can we sound this word out? That's a little more student friendly. It gets them to the intent of the indicator, but in more accessible vocabulary. Eliminates those vocabulary barriers, like you're saying, Constance. Yes. Now, when we talk about the indicator language of blend, our collaborative discussion question could be, how can we put these sounds together? When we talk about decode by analogy, I've heard a lot of people in the field struggle with this. Like, what does that mean? Decode by analogy. Well, a collaborative discussion question that gets to the intent of that is there any part of this word that reminds you of another word you know? When we think about context, a collaborative discussion question we might use is, what word would make sense in this sentence? And then when we use the indicator language of visuals, a way to collaboratively discuss that could be, how did the pictures support you in solving this word? Or how did the graphs support you in solving this word? It gives you access to the indicator, but in that collaborative discussion setting. All right, then we move on to writing objectives based on the indicator. Now, the learning objectives need to include the indicator language. I developed 4 learning objectives on the indicator that we're using for the cross-check method. Students will learn to read by segmenting. Students will learn to read by blending. Students will read by decoding words by recognizing parts they know in other words, and they will read by using context and visuals. So I was able to create 4 learning objectives from one indicator. Now, if you need support for the audience that you support with writing learning objectives, we've included a resource on the template linked right there in the yellow box. After you develop your learning objectives, then you move to developing success criteria. So your success criteria is like the observable results that you're looking for if students can demonstrate success with this indicator. Support for writing success criteria can be found in that yellow box on the template. If that's something that the PLC or audience that you support needs work on that. But here's my success criteria. Is that students will read a passage with 95% accuracy, solving any unknown words by segmenting, blending, decoding words by analogy, and using context and visuals. It's a pretty hefty expectation, but that matches the expectation of the indicator. The indicator says and, then my success criteria says and. All right, so then after we have created our success criteria, now we need to take a look at some mini lessons that we'll develop in order to get to the intent of that indicator. So how long do you think this would take? How many mini lessons do you need to teach each objective? Well, that is dictated by the indicator. Maybe you need 5, 7, 10 mini lessons in order to successfully implement the indicator. Here, I feel like for my first round of teaching this indicator, I could teach it in 5 mini lessons. I can do a mini lesson on segmenting, a mini lesson on blending, a mini lesson on decoding by analogy, which is the example shown here, a mini lesson on using context and visuals, and then finally a mini lesson where I put it all into practice. This might be the first time I teach this indicator that I have 5 mini lessons. And then after my reflect, I see that I need to redo this indicator again in my mini lessons. And I might do 3 lessons on decoding by analogy, but only 1 lesson on blending. It just depends on how things land in your classroom and in your setting. So take a look at how I developed this lesson for lesson 3 of our sequence of mini lessons. I wrote out my connection or hook of how I'll get students engaged. I have my collaborative discussion questions listed here, very intentionally planned. And then I have the actual meat of my mini lesson, how I'll model, give examples, and then I even write out like the word that I'm going to be decoding by analogy in front of my students. The next part of this is where I wrote out how am I going to have students to demonstrate their understanding? And it's going to be partner reading. So I want them to demonstrate the strategy to decode unknown words with a partner. And then my reflection and closure. I have a reflection question for my students to answer. What did you do when you came to a word in the text you didn't know? Well, hopefully they're going to mention decoding by analogy, or they're going to mention segmenting and blending, which were 2 previous mini lessons taught to my students. All right, after you go through and develop your sequence of mini lessons, then we go back to that check for alignment. Now, again, the check for alignment takes place before any instruction takes place. Some areas that I noted in my check for alignment was that I went back and made sure that all of the skills in the indicator were addressed. All of the content is addressed, and I'm matching the rigor of the indicator expectation. Another place that I wanted to check before I move forward was that I had the materials I needed to teach these mini lessons in place. For this indicator particularly, I need some specific materials, including anchor charts of all of those decoding strategies, so that students are able to readily access those after instruction when they're in their independent reading. Additionally, I need some shared reading text for me to model this and practice in front of my students. I'm also going to need highlight tape. That's one small thing that I need to keep in the back of my mind so that I'm highlighting the word I'm decoding for that visual aspect for my students. And then another aspect I need to go ahead and intentionally plan is that I have to have an independent reading level text for each of my students so that they can demonstrate for my assessment aspect. So that's a huge planning piece that I need to take into consideration before I ever start my instruction. Now, one other aspect that I might want to consider before I start my instruction is checking or consulting with an ML or SPED teachers just to ensure my alignment of strategies. We know that our gen ed teachers serve our special ed students typically 80% of their day. So we want to make sure that the strategies that we're using in our general education classrooms align to the instruction students maybe are receiving in their ML or SPED settings as well. So when I'm talking through these decoding strategies, I want to share those with my ML and SPED teachers and see if they have any feedback for me, but also so that they can be instructing in the same way and there's alignment. So that's a huge focus for me as an elementary school teacher. Now, after the instruction begins and we have our whole instructional phase, I need to go back and do some reflection. I have to think about my students who've already mastered it. Why did they master it? What was the most successful part of my instruction? But then also I need to think about what are my next steps for my students who weren't able to master all of those decoding strategies? Where does my reteaching need to take place? Or where can I focus my Tier 2 intervention for students to be able to demonstrate success with that strategy? So the reflection phase is also really important for my next steps. Okay, that was a lot, right? What do I do now? Do I go take every indicator that I teach and do the cross-check method for the next 200 hours? Absolutely not. That first aspect of what we did today was important. We wanted you just to recognize what indicators do you think the cross-check method would be impactful for? And you have your short list here captured in the chat. But what we really want you to know is that in box 7 of your note catcher, we've got resources. So often we hear, well, that was good and all, but what do I do now? On box 7 in your note catcher, you have a link to a Wakelet. Included in that Wakelet is this presentation and other presentations that we've done on the cross-check method. There's a video recording of how to use the cross-check method. There's an example for each grade band, K2, 3, 5, 6, 8, and English 1 through 4, of using the cross-check method for instruction. We have blank digital and PDF templates for you to use to try out the cross-check method with an indicator. We have linked to our glossary of the standards for helping you define those content and skills. We have the vertical articulations where you can look at how an indicator progresses from grade to grade. And then in addition to that, we have support documents for how to write learning objectives and success criteria and text-dependent questions and collaborative discussion questions. So you've got a plethora of resources at your fingertips. But we don't want to diminish the aspect that sometimes there's a human quotient in there that you need access to as well. So our team is happy to meet with you to walk through these resources if you need extra support for any of your next steps. You're welcome to email any of us, me, Tabitha, Brenna, or Casey, and we can set up a time to talk virtually with all of these resources or what your next step may be. With that in mind, let's talk about some clarity and closure. And what is your next step? So we want you to take 3 steps forward at the end of our time together today. The first step we want you to take is just to explore these resources. Okay, you've got a million things to look at. Just take a look at them, right? What's the harm in opening some documents and familiarizing yourself with this idea? Because this is our bridge year, right? This is our year to just test things out. In the 24-25 school year, the expectation is that this is fully implemented. So take your time now just to explore these resources. Next, we want you to think about who could you partner with in this work? Could you partner with one of us? And we give you some support for navigating the cross-check method and the indicators that have the most impact for the audience that you serve? Or is there someone in your building that you can support or that you can work with? Or somebody in your district? Maybe this needs to be shared with some leadership there so that we can get these indicators implemented. But we want you to take one last small step of trying this with just one indicator. It may be in the foundations of literacy, it may be in communications, but pick one indicator that you feel is going to have the greatest impact for you in the classroom or for the audience that you support. We want you to try this out. As you do that this next week, if you pick an indicator, give this a try, walk through it, and you want to share it with somebody, I welcome you to share that with me and let me give you some feedback. Maybe you get in the middle of this cross-check process and you think, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do next. We can hop on a meeting virtually and walk through it. Maybe you just want me to look at your template that you complete on one of the indicators. I'd love to walk you through that as well. All right. On our last slide, hopefully you're not too overwhelmed or too anxious about the tasks I've just shared with you, but you feel empowered to go forth and make your next step. That being said, we want to give you an opportunity to give us some feedback. On February 26th, we will have our second cross-check method webinar that will focus on the applications of reading. I want you to provide us some feedback in our feedback survey today of how we could improve this session and make it better or more effective for the next time. Additionally, if you have any questions or requests, we'd love for you to drop that into your survey feedback as well. Include your email address if you want me to respond, or you have my email address on this slide here. Send me a direct email and let me know what you're feeling or if I can support you in any way. We here at SCDE are willing and ready to support you as best we can. You may have to wait for a response from me till Wednesday. Tomorrow, I get to go to the TDW session and finally hear about the text-dependent writing aspect of SC Ready. So I'll be engaged tomorrow, but I'd love to work with you and support you in any way that I can. We appreciate you attending these webinars and being with us today. My team will listen and linger till about 1:05 today if you have any questions, but we truly thank you for engaging with us today. And we are very hopeful for what South Carolina can look like in 20 years. So thank you guys.